Ever get that feeling the society operates, I don't know, a bit like a high-stakes game, where some players seem to have a stacked deck?
Yeah, definitely.
Today on the Deep Dive, we're really zeroing in on one way to understand why that might be the case: conflict theory.
Exactly. And it's a different way of looking at things. Instead of picturing society as this smoothly running machine, conflict theory asks us to see it more as an ongoing negotiation.
Or sometimes a struggle, right?
Sometimes a downright struggle, yeah. Between different groups, all with competing interests. Think of it like a constant push and pull for limited resources,
Oh,
for
yeah.
influence. Power and inequality aren't just side effects here, they're seen as fundamental.
Which is pretty different from views that focus more on, say, harmony or
Yeah.
shared values.
Totally different lens.
Right.
Mm.
And the material we've looked at really digs into this perspective.
Yeah.
Where it came from, its core ideas, and how you can actually see it playing out. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull out the key insights from these sources so you can start spotting these power dynamics, these inequalities in everyday life, in the world around you.
Sounds good. Where should we start? The beginning.
Yeah, let's talk origins. Where did this whole perspective come from?
Well, the foundational voice, you really have to start with Karl Marx.
Oh, Marx, mid-19th century.
Exactly. Think Industrial Revolution. Marx looked around and saw this really stark division. On one side, you had the bourgeoisie, the owners, the ones with the factories, the capital.
And on the other?
The proletariat, the workers, the ones who had nothing to sell but their labor, really, just to survive.
And he didn't exactly see them getting along, did he? I remember that famous quote.
Oh, yeah. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
That's a powerful statement. Very definitive.
It really is. For Marx, this wasn't just about, some people having more money. It was about a fundamental power imbalance baked right into the economic system itself.
The owners had the power. The workers were exploited. That was the core conflict.
That was the core economic conflict for him, yes. But he wasn't the only one seeing conflict as central. Other thinkers built on this.
Right, like Max Weber. He's crucial here, isn't he? He kind of broadened things out.
He really did. Weber took Marx's ideas about economic class, but said, hang on, conflict isn't only about that.
So what else did Weber bring in?
What's fascinating is his focus on multiple dimensions. So beyond just economics, he looked at status in like social prestige, honor, and also power in a wider sense, like political influence.
Okay. So conflict could happen in politics, religion, culture, not just the factory floor.
Precisely. The struggle for dominance wasn't just about who owned the means of production, it was broader.
Then later you get C. Wright Mills talking about the power elite.
Yeah, Mills, his idea was that a pretty small interconnected group runs things. People at the top of big institutions, government, corporations, the military.
They hold the real power, make the key decisions.
That was his argument. It really highlights how power can get concentrated. And then there's Ralph Dahrendorf. He had a slightly different angle.
What was his focus?
Authority. Dahrendorf argued that conflict just naturally arises because some people have the authority to give orders and others have to obey.
The boss and the employee, the government and the citizen, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That basic inequality in authority is, for him, a constant source of potential tension and conflict.
Okay, so these thinkers, Marx, Weber, Mills, Dahrendorf, they lead the groundwork. What are the absolute core beliefs of conflict theory, the main takeaways?
Right, the core assumptions. First, and this is fundamental, society is inherently unequal. It's not a bug, it's a feature, you could say.
Inequality is the starting point.
Got it. Second, our social structures, laws, institutions, even customs, they tend to benefit those already in power, so they kind of lock in those inequalities.
Which leads to the next point, right? That conflict isn't just some rare event.
Exactly. Assumption 3. Conflict is basically unavoidable. It's an ongoing part of society. And importantly, conflict theory often suggests this conflict isn't always bad. It can actually drive social change, drive progress.
Like civil rights movements or labor movements and people pushing back.
Precisely. Those came from challenging the existing power structures. And this leads to another critical point. Social order isn't just maintained because we all agree on things.
How is it maintained, though?
Often through domination. Certain groups have the power to impose their will on others.
Okay, so it's not always consensus. Sometimes it's just power holding things together. And what about how dominant groups stay dominant?
Well, that's the final core assumption, really. It brings in the idea of ideology.
Ideology, how so?
Powerful groups use institutions, think education, religion, the legal system, the media, to spread ideas and beliefs that make their power seem legitimate.
Make the existing inequalities seem normal
Yeah.
or even fair.
Exactly. Natural, inevitable, maybe even deserved. It justifies the status quo.
Okay, so if society is this arena of competing interests, where do we actually see these conflicts playing out most clearly? The sources gave some key areas.
Absolutely. Let's start with the big one. Given Marx class, the basic conflict between workers and owners.
We still see that today, right? Income inequality debates.
Oh, definitely. You see huge corporate profits, maybe CEO pay skyrocketing, while wages for many workers stay flat. That's a classic example. And think about labor unions. They arose specifically as a way for workers to band together and challenge that power imbalance.
Makes sense. What's another major area?
Race and ethnicity. Conflict theory is really useful for understanding things like systemic racism, white privilege,
Yeah.
how these create and maintain deep inequalities.
And the sources mentioned the criminal justice system as an example here.
Yes, a stark one. The argument is that things like the disproportionate incarceration of poor people and minorities compared to maybe more lenient treatment for white-collar crime, that's not just random.
It's potentially the system itself being biased.
Conflict theorists would argue, yes, the structure disadvantages certain groups. You also hear about the prison industrial complex, right? The idea that there are financial interests in keeping prisons full. That fits this perspective too.
Wow, okay. And gender. That has to be in here.
Absolutely. Patriarchy, the persistent wage gap conflict theory, especially feminist versions of it, sees these as clear examples of conflict rooted in historical power imbalances between men and women.
And politically.
Well, think about the influence of money in politics. Big donors versus average voters. Who really gets heard? Whose interests shape the agenda? That's a major site of conflict.
Religion, too, sometimes.
Sure, conflicts can arise between dominant religious groups and minority faiths over power, discrimination, resources.
And education. I remember reading about that.
Yes, education is critical. You see huge disparities, right? Well-funded private schools, often for the wealthy, versus underfunded public schools in poorer areas.
And that impacts opportunities later on.
Massively. It can perpetuate inequality across generations. Even things like standardized tests have been critiqued from this perspective, arguing they might reflect socioeconomic advantage more than pure ability.
And lastly, the media. That came up too.
Big time. When just a few giant corporations own most of the media outlets, well, you have to ask questions.
Like who controls the narrative?
Exactly. Whose stories get told, whose voices get amplified, and whose get pushed to the margins. That control over information is a huge source of power and potential conflict.
So it applies across the board. Class, race, gender, politics, education, media.
Yeah, it's a lens you can apply almost anywhere you see power and resources being distributed unevenly.
So to really bring this into focus for you, the listener, maybe give some concrete current examples. Where is conflict theory really visible right now?
Well, we touched on income inequality. That CEO-worker pay gap is a constant headline, isn't it? Clear class conflict. The ongoing issues in the criminal justice system, the racial disparities, that's a powerful and often tragic example of systemic inequality in action.
And education.
The funding gaps between schools in wealthy and poor neighborhoods, that directly translates into unequal opportunities. It's a clear conflict over resources vital for social mobility.
And the media ownership thing feels very current too.
Definitely. Concerns about concentrated media power and its effect on public opinion are everywhere. Who shapes what we think? That's a conflict theory question.
So this isn't just some dusty old theory. It's actively being used and even evolving, right?
Absolutely. It's constantly being adapted. Think about critical race theory, CRT. It specifically looks at how laws and institutions, even if they seem neutral, actually perpetuate racial inequality.
That's drawn directly from conflict perspectives.
Very much so. And like we said, feminist theory keeps analyzing those gender-based power imbalances. Then you've got queer theory, which challenges, dominant heterosexual norms and looks at how LGBTQ plus people face marginalization and discrimination within existing power structures.
Globally?
Post-colonial theory is huge. It examines the lasting effects of colonialism, the power imbalances between the global North and South, the ongoing economic and political struggles rooted in that history.
Okay, so it's clear this perspective offers a really valuable way of seeing the world. What would you say are its main strengths? Why is it such a useful tool for people to have?
I think its biggest strength is that direct focus on power and inequality. It forces you to ask who benefits here, who's losing out in any social situation.
It uncovers those hidden dynamics.
Exactly. And it also emphasizes agency people aren't just puppets. There's always potential for resistance, for challenging things.
Right, it's not totally pessimistic. It actually helps explain social movements, social change.
Precisely. It gives you a framework for understanding why people protest, why revolutions happen, and maybe most importantly, it encourages a critical stance. It pushes you to question the mainstream ideas, the institutions we take for granted, and ask, wait, whose interests do these really serve?
That's incredibly valuable. But like any theory, it's not perfect. It must have limitations or criticisms, really.
Oh, for sure. No theory explains everything perfectly. One common criticism is that it can sometimes overemphasize conflict.
Like it misses the cooperation and harmony that also exist.
Exactly. Societies do have shared values, people cooperate all the time. Conflict theory might sometimes downplay that side of things. There's also a risk of it being a bit deterministic,
Meaning,
suggesting people are always just defined by being either oppressed or oppressor. It can simplify things too much, miss the nuances of individual lives and identities.
and what about individual choices? Does it sometimes ignore those?
That's another point critics make. It might not fully account for individual agency or for non-material factors like culture, values, emotions, which obviously shape how people behave.
Yeah, life isn't just about power struggles.
Right, and sometimes it can lead to a kind of simplistic us versus them mentality, which doesn't always capture the complexity of real-world relationships and conflicts.
Okay, so a powerful lens, definitely, but maybe not the only lens you should use.
Got it. To sort of wrap things up and connect it to events people recognize, can you give a couple more recent examples where this theory really illuminates what's going on?
Absolutely. The Black Lives Matter movement is a prime example.
How so?
It's a direct response to what activists argue is systemic racism, police brutality. Conflict theory helps frame this not just as isolated incidents, but as stemming from deep-seated institutional power imbalances and historical inequality.
Okay, makes sense. What about globally?
Think about the Arab Spring uprisings a while back. What drove those? Largely economic frustration, lack of freedom, corruption.
People pushing back against the powerful.
Exactly. Struggles against entrenched, often oppressive power structures. Classic conflict theory scenario.
And maybe one more.
The hashtag #MeToo movement.
Ah, yes. It powerfully exposed the really pervasive gendered power dynamics in workplaces, Hollywood, politics, showing how imbalances of power enabled widespread harassment and abuse. That's conflict emerging from deeply ingrained power structures.
So clear examples of the theory playing out.
Yeah. So even with its limitations, it remains a really vital way to understand how power and inequality fundamentally shape our world.
So wrapping this up,
Yeah.
the core message really is society isn't necessarily a level playing field. It's more of a dynamic space, an arena maybe, where different groups are constantly competing for resources, for influence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really crucial for us, for you, the listener, to keep asking, who benefits from the way things are set up right now?
That's exactly right. Understanding these underlying dynamics, these conflicts, gives you a more critical awareness and maybe, just maybe, helps in thinking about how to build a more fair, more equitable society.
So here's a final thought for you to take away. As you go about your day, maybe reflect on a situation you see could be at work, in your community, something in the news. Ask yourself, who are the different groups here? What are they competing for? Resources, status, control. And how does power seem to be shaping what happens? What questions does thinking at it this way raise for you about how things are organized? Definitely something to keep pondering.